seated. There are other points in the tour where you can stand up, take pictures. I will let you know when those are so you don't miss out on those opportunities, but right now, it's best to just stay seated. Now, before we get into all that, I get this one question a lot, so I want to cover that before we go any further. On the other side over here, on your left, you can see there's a little wall over there. On the other side, there's some boats. Also, there's some water. Also, it's not the ocean. Out there is Lake Michigan. That's a big lake. Some would even call it a Great Lake. You can't see the other side of it, but it is just a lake here in the Midwest, the middle of the United States. There are no oceans around you. That's Lake Michigan. This is the Chicago River. Towards the end of the tour, we're going to talk about how these two connect and interact well with what we have. So as we head out the other side of this bridge, feel free to get those pictures, and it is my pleasure to officially welcome you to Chicago. As we head out from under the bridge, we're joined by architect Jeannie Gang. We're going to see more of Jeannie Gang's work in just a few moments. Now, the St. Regis Tower is a residential building, but the bottom few floors are actually a hotel. If you're thinking that seems like a nice place to stay, maybe think again. The cheapest room is $700 a night, so it is a really, really nice place to stay. But you're also probably better off with where you are right now. Save a little bit of money. Back and forth in any direction without causing problems for those inside. Fun fact though, a reasonable sway is also how Lainey decides if you can have another drink at the bar, and I don't see anybody reasonably swaying yet, so head on back there. She just gets bored and then she starts to heckle, and that's not nice for anybody. We're going to talk about other ways buildings keep themselves standing further down on the tour. But for right now, still on your left, we have this building at an angle here, the Swiss Hotel. It's actually a triangular-shaped building, because it was designed by Harry Weiss, an architect who loved triangles. So much so, he designed a very similar-looking building to this one further downtown. That other building is called the Metropolitan Correctional Center. So given the choice, I would stay at this one. It's much nicer. We'll see more of Harry Weiss's work later on the tour. You'll probably recognize it. He really loved triangles. Right behind it, though, there's all those wavy balconies. That is Aqua Tower. And if you remember Jeannie Gang from mere moments ago, she designed this building too. And we know St. Regis is the tallest building in the world designed by a woman. Aqua Tower is the third tallest building in the world designed by a woman. So Chicago is very proud to have both of those, and Jeannie Gang was no stranger to that title. As we head out the other side of the bridge, on your right, Tower. Now this building is, and further down on your right, it's got a clock tower. It looks like Wrigley Field and Wrigley chewing gum, juicy fruit. So if you have ever had Wrigley chewing gum, you didn't help build that. That was already there. But you did help someone get very, very rich. And isn't that what it's really all about? Speaking of very, very rich, right in front of you is Trump International Hotel and Tower, the second tallest building in all of Chicago. This is a style of architecture known as contextualism. Contextualism is all about complementing the context, blending in with the surroundings, which is why it has its name on it in giant letters. Kidding. It's why it's got that glass face that visually connects it to the water below, as well as reflects all of these beautiful buildings around it. You might have also noticed it has 3 patio-like things, or setbacks. Each setback is the same height as a building near it. So that first one, same height as the Wrigley building. That second setback is the same height as this white rocket ship-looking building right across the river. And that third setback is the same height as the big black box building right on the other side. We'll see that low. You're absolutely right. The asking price was $30 million, and they lowered it so us regular folk could have a shot. My favorite thing about it, heads up, we're going to talk about Batman a lot on the tour. If you've ever seen The Dark Knight, at the end of the movie, Batman and Joker fight in a construction site. That was Trump Tower. It was being built at the time, so it looks incredibly different now. But coming up on your right, arguably the most iconic buildings on the tour. Behold, Marina City, or less dramatically, the Corn Cobs. These are residential towers outfitted with parking, restaurants, offices, stores, a movie theater turned the House of Blues, and judging by this crowd, it's got exactly what you're looking for. Those buildings have yacht parking. They are a city within a city because they were built in the 1960s when everything around us was an industrial district. Nobody was living here. So Bertrand Goldberg, who designed those towers, wanted to draw people into the riverfront. He wanted to draw people into the center of our city. You can see the yacht parking on your right. Above it, regular parking. Fun fact, that is valet parking. You are not allowed to park your own car in your own building. They just don't think you'd be skilled enough to do it, so somebody else does it for you. And Marina City is all about drawing people into the riverfront. That's something Chicago really cares about. And the best example of this is on your left, the fabulous Chicago Riverwalk, which might be a little newer than you thought it was, because this Riverwalk was originally designed on a plan for the city in 1909, but they didn't start construction on it until 2003, and it wasn't completed until 2016, so better late than never. Coming up right behind the Riverwalk, we have this glass and white granite building, 77 West Wacker. This is a neoclassical style building because it combines neo or new materials like glass and granite with classical styles like Greek and Roman. Because if you look all the way up there, it looks like the Parthenon, a Greek temple, is sitting on top of the building. This is my favorite building on the river. I just like it. Looks a little different from everything else around it. And speaking of what's around it, right next door is 111 West Wacker, the glass building with the weird looking cutouts. And when I'm not doing this, I do real estate. I recently took a client on a tour of that building. When we walked in the front doors, they handed us glasses of champagne. It was very fun, it was very fancy. It told me I cannot afford to live there. If you're wondering though, the smallest apartment in that building starts at $3,000 a month. It only goes up from there, and trust me, it goes up so much. It's upsetting. But it is very nice in there, so you can get what you paid for. I think the most interesting part of the building is that first balcony cutout, because that's where they originally stopped building the building. They started working on this in 2008, famously great year for residential buildings. Unfortunately, economy wasn't doing so great. They got about halfway up, then they couldn't finish the building. More recently, Chicago completed it, but we left that cutout paying our respects to those architects that came before us. We're going to see a couple examples of Chicago's architects paying the respects to the history, the architecture, everything that came before them. In fact, there's another example of that on your left. This shorter, wider building called the Builder's Building, because architects are bad at naming things. But the important thing with this one is the larger left portion was built in 1927, and the smaller right portion was built just a few years later, 1986. Almost 60 years apart, but it still looks like one cohesive structure. Architects of the newer side referencing the original style. Now we're going to head under the Wells Street Bridge, and I know what you're thinking, Keegan, this looks like every other bridge I've seen today. Why should I care about this one? You're right, it does look the same, but this is only 10 years old. It is a perfect replica of the original, which was here for 91 years. This one plans to be here for 91 more, and I sure hope it will be, because most of you are still under it. But as we head safely on the other side, on your right, Merchandise Mart. This is a very large example of Art Deco. Now you can identify Art Deco buildings from those deep inset windows, the vertical lines shooting up the building like a pinstripe suit, and the machine-made precision. It was built for the age of optimism here in America, the roaring 1920s. And watching over all of this, those heads on pikes, those are the merchant princes of Chicago. Big businessmen at the time who used their vast fortunes to help jumpstart this city, men like Marshall Field and Montgomery Ward. They may have been big businessmen back then, but that is now where seagulls go to do their big business. Not quite as elegant anymore. We are going to see something pretty elegant as we head out the other side of the Franklin Street Bridge, because right now we are about to enter Wolf Point, otherwise known as the birthplace of Chicago. This is where all the branches of the river come together. It's where the city first got its start. We got a train going across the Lake Street Bridge right ahead of you. Classic Chicago photo right there if you want to get that. And it stopped for you. Well, it slowed down. That's nice. The train in Chicago is called the L. It stands for elevated because the train is elevated. It's above ground. It's going across that bridge, which is a Chicago-style bridge, because that's how Chicago has been designing their bridges for a very long time. And it came from the downtown area we call the Loop because the train goes in a loop. Chicago did not work hard to name anything in our city. Keeping that in mind, we have this building which is right here on the main point of the river. That's River Point, the Hot Pocket, or McDonald's Pie Box, or deodorant-shaped building. Everybody sees something different, call it whatever you want, everybody does. It is still contextualism, though. It's got that curve in it to mimic the curve of the river, complementing its surroundings. Now we're going to start to head up the north branch of the Chicago River. And as we do, coming into view is a shorter peach-colored building. That is the oldest building you will see on the tour today. It is from the 1890s. Now that building is Fulton House. It is a former meatpacking freezer. Nowadays it is a residential building. In the 1970s that building was renovated so it could remain relevant, which means the windows, the balconies, anything interesting about this building was added in the 70s. Before that, this was a big boring box right in the center of our city. Most importantly though, you found where I fell asleep on the tour, so we are done with that building. We're going to switch to the other side of the river. Right across from it, there's this raised bridge right here, the Carroll Street Railroad Bridge. And this is a great example of how all our bridges work. Because on the back of it, there's that giant chunk of concrete. That is a counterweight. As the counterweight is raised and lowered, the bridge itself raises and lowers. All of our bridges work like this, like a seesaw. The other ones just have their counterweights hidden, so they look a little nicer, a little newer than this one does. This one's also fun because it's a great example, a reminder really, of my mother's expectations for me. This bridge never lowers. That's a lie. It lowers once a year. So one truck can go across and it will remain in active status. Which actually does work because my mother's expectations do lower once a year when she is reminded that I'm still single. So, ladies, here all week. Actually, that's a lie. I have tomorrow off, but just come back later. Now, on the other side of the river, we've got these triangle-shaped buildings, the River Cottages, designed by Harry Weiss. That guy really loved triangles. More than that, though, he loved sailboats, so he designed these in the shape of a sail with round porthole-like windows on them, trying to make you think of sailboats. He wanted to draw people into the riverfront with these buildings. But that has not always been the case. Not all of Chicago has wanted to have people hanging out by the river, because the river wasn't always this clean, so people just didn't want to be here. As we head out the other side of the bridge, you will see an example of that, because on your right, there's this big blue building, the East Bank Club. And you might be looking at it thinking, why does it feel like I'm looking at the back of the building? It's because you're looking at the back of the building. This building faces away from the river. In fact, it used to be right up against the water. This river walk right here that lovely person is walking along is a much more recent addition, because nowadays people want to be near the river. All these buildings have to work around that. Buildings that are much newer do have an advantage. They knew this was going to happen, so they've started to plan ahead with the river walks. That was not always the case. Nowadays, Chicago's trying to bring some life back. We're trying to clean our river up. So far, it seems to be working. Now in just a moment, Captain Ben is going to expertly spin this boat around, take us down the South Branch to show you more of our city. But right now, feel free to get up, stretch your legs, use the restroom, visit the bar. I hear ladies getting lonely. Do what you gotta do. I'll be walking around in case you have any questions.
Excuse me, sir.
Hi.
Can you take a picture of us?
House is $20 million, which means those are $17.5 million cheaper. So they're just a steal. Go get one. The River Cottages are a little cheaper, not by much, $2.25 million, but they don't come on the market very often. There are 4 of them. 3 out of the 4 are still owned by the same people who bought them when they first opened up. Nobody wants to give those away. Then the East Bank Club is a high-end fitness center and club. Monthly membership is pretty pricey, but you get to work out in the same place Obama and Oprah did, so that's kind of cool. Now as we head back into Wolf Point towards the South Branch, you can see that a lot of buildings in this area sort of are blending in. They have that curve to it. They're contextualism. They're complementing the river, everything around them. Then there's one building that decided, I don't care, I'm going to do what I want. Right ahead of you, that's the Y-shaped building, 150 North Riverside. Why is it shaped like that? Well, Chicago has a rule that buildings must be built 30 feet back from the riverfront to make way for the river walk. But the other side of the building is train lines, and you can't build on those. So this building is pinched between those 2 immovable objects, meaning its base is only 39 feet wide. That's about as wide as a school bus is long. That is not very big for a building. very skinny building, a very windy city. You can see how that might cause some problems. Which is why, on the top level of this building, made some of you look, you can't see it, it's inside. But on that top level, there are 12 giant tanks of water. These are called inertial slosh dampers. And as the wind blows the building one way, the water in the tanks sloshes the other. It goes back and forth, slowing the building down and reducing its sway. It's a very unique way to keep your building standing. Only 2 buildings in Chicago use that system. This one in St. Regis, the first building on our tour. So tall it needs 2 ways to keep it falling over. If you want a cool photo, you might be able to see your reflection in the building's windows right here. And if you're wondering, it is 160,000 gallons of water that are in those 12 giant tanks up at the top of the building. I think it's pretty cool. If there is a fire, those giant tanks of water can be used to put the fire out, which is fun. But then the building might fall over. So I guess if it's windy and there's a fire, you just have to pick and choose. What do you want to do? Now, since we were talking about that 30-foot setback rule over there, we're going to keep that going on your left because we've got the Bank of America building coming up here, and they dealt with that rule, but they did something different. They vaulted their 3rd floor and held it up by these giant metal tripod legs, so people like those wonderful people can walk by underneath. And it is the Bank of America building, so if any of you are patrons of Bank of America, congratulations! This is what your money's been going towards the past couple of years. Building like this takes about 3 years and $800 million to make. You built a very expensive building. I hope you like it. As we head out the other side of this bridge, we are going to enter the time machine. We're going back in time to the 1920s. We're going to head forward through the decades till we get back to the present day. All the buildings in the time machine are going to be on your right, starting with 2 Riverside Plaza. So grab your Tommy gun and hide your alcohol. We're back in the roaring 1920s. But you might have already known that, because this building has inset windows, pinstripe suit, machine-made precision. It's an Art Deco building. Unfortunately, it was built in 1929. And if you're familiar with U.S. history, you're aware of what happened next. Everything went bad. There was the Great Depression, and then we went to war. So for 25 years here in Chicago, there were almost no office buildings built. Height of the Roaring 20s, buildings popped up all over the place, but by the end of the 20s, huge surplus with no demand. Don't worry too much though. On the other side of this bridge, it's 25 years later. So as we head under, grab your space suits and your Cuban missiles. We're going back to the 1960s. And as you can see, this generation of architects was a no-nonsense group. They grew up in the Great Depression, they went to war, so when they came back home, they didn't care for the fancy, gaudy, extravagant architecture that was there before them. They just didn't have time for that. So where there once was elegant cathedrals, they now built big black boxes, like Gateway Center 1 and Gateway Center 2. This is known as black box modernism, and it was popularized by Mies van der Rohe, an incredibly influential architect of his time. His famous saying was, "Less is more." So when he designed a building, he wanted to show off its functionality. He didn't want to worry about how many gargoyles each building should have, so he decided they would have none. If he added anything, it was a plaza around the outside for people to gather, but no decorations. Now we're leaving the 60s, we're entering the 70s with Gateway Center 3. This is international style. That's because buildings like this popped up in cities all over the world in the 70s. It was a cookie-cutter, copy-paste type of building that could be thrown up wherever one was needed. Basically, if you asked a 5-year-old to draw a building, that's what you're gonna get. It is very simple, it looks a lot like modernism, but it is its own unique style. They used new materials and added a splash of color, so it's a little softer, a little warmer than just the plain steel that came before it. But now we've seen Gateway Center 1, we've seen Gateway Center 2, and we've seen Gateway Center 3, and we know architects are unimaginative when it comes to naming things. So the next building is, of course, Gateway Center 4. But this generation was a little fed up with the previous ones. Everybody before them kept saying, "Stay in the lines, make a box, don't make a fuss." This generation said, "We're different, we're cool, we're gnarly. It's the 80s, we're making weird curvy structures." Meaning contextualism got its start in the 80s. You can see Gateway Center 4 has that curve to mimic the river, that reflective glass to show off its surroundings. So as we head under this next bridge, you will be safe and sound back in good old 2024. But now you're aware of how architecture has evolved in Chicago and most of America. From elegant cathedrals emulating Europe in the early 20s to machine-made Art Deco in the late 20s. America went to war, and when we returned, we built serious, big black boxes in the 60s, followed by big white boxes in the 70s, and then big curvy boxes in the 80s, and ever since. Recognize this next building on your right if you saw Batman The Dark Knight, because obviously that is Gotham Bank. If you remember in the opening scene of the movie, Joker's gang zip lines down onto the roof of this building, they rob the bank, and at the end of the scene, Joker drives a school bus outside and escapes down this street. He thought he was getting away with a bunch of cash. He probably got away with a bunch of old catalogs, because that is not Gotham Bank. It is Old Main, Chicago's largest post office. Although, as you will see on the other side of the bridge, it is not a post office anymore. It's now offices for Uber and Walgreens, among other businesses. Well, while Batman was filming here, this building was deserted. So it's a great example of how Chicago keeps our architecture. We'll take a rundown building and keep the beautiful exterior, but renovate the inside, bringing some life back to it. And don't worry, this building was not a waste of space. Back in the day, this was the mail order catalog capital of the world. Everybody everywhere wanted to know what Sears department store was up to. This building had to take care of it. Now we're gonna head a little further down on the South Branch before we spin the boat around, take you back up it, but I'm gonna stop talking about buildings for a bit. Instead, I'm gonna switch over to story time. Tell you some stories about the history of Chicago and then explain how the city took the shape it has today. But I will do that on the other side of the bridge, because this is usually a very loud bridge. Story time. So, story number one is the fire. Some of you might have heard about a certain Chicago fire, kind of big deal, lots of people were talking about it. Well, this fire happened on the night of October 8th, 1871, just a few blocks away from us, right over there to your right. Now, it started as a very small fire, but 30-mile-per-hour winds whipped it up into a blazing inferno. And at this point in the city's history, this river was gross. It was a sewer, and it was covered in a sheet of oil. Now, these 30-mile-per-hour winds created literal fire tornadoes, which moved closer and closer and caught the river itself on fire. The wind continued to push it, and the fire spread to the rest of the city, burning most of it down. In the end, 18,000 buildings were destroyed, 100,000 people were left homeless, and 300 more perished in the fire. Chicago was devastated, and they were looking for someone, anyone, to blame for this tragedy. So they picked the obvious choice, and they blamed a cow. Some of you may be familiar with this legend. Chicago's been spreading it for quite some time. The legend goes that on that same fateful night, in that same fateful place, Mrs. Catherine O'Leary went to sleep. But in the bar next door, her cow stayed awake. And this cow purposefully, and with malicious intent, kicked over a kerosene lantern, lighting the barn on fire, and soon the whole city with it. And like any good legend, it does have a kernel of truth to it, but a lot of it is made up. We know that Mrs. Catherine O'Leary was a real Irish Catholic immigrant woman. We know she had a barn, we know she had a cow, presumably she had a lantern. We don't actually know how the fire started. In the end, though, it doesn't really matter, because we know it ended with this city being destroyed. And what are you going to do when your whole city burns down? Well, Chicago is a city of second chances, a city of redemption. So they called in architects to rebuild, and they used steel. So when Chicago 2.0 rose from the ashes, it was the birthplace of the first ever 10-story steel frame skyscraper. And a whole city coming back from fire? Surely a story of redemption. But Chicago wasn't done just yet. We cut to 22 years later, where story number 2 takes place, the fair. Because at this point, the World's Fair is coming around, and Chicago wants it. So they send their politicians out to petition to host it, and this is actually where we got one of our famous nicknames. Because yes, this is a windy city, but that is not how we got that name. We got that name because everybody who met these Chicago politicians had the same thing to say about them. They were long-winded, full of hot air and windbags, and thus the Windy City was born. And it must have worked, because kind of famously, Chicago got the fair. So now the 1893 World's Fair is in full swing, and it was all planned by Daniel Burnham. This was an architect with a vision for this city and a whole fair to work with, so he designed the White City. This was 200 temporary buildings designed to look like Venice, Italy, gorgeous, classical, European-style architecture, all painted white. If you're wondering what this might have looks like, I suggest heading to the south side to see the Museum of Science and Industry. It is a great example of that style and a very cool place to visit. But unfortunately, everything must come to an end, and 6 months after that fair opened, it closed, with an astonishing total of 27 million visitors from 46 different countries. The fair was a huge success. And that takes us to the third and final story, the plan. Because after the fair ended, Chicago still wanted to create, so they hired Daniel Burnham once again to create the first comprehensive urban city plan in the country. He decided to call this the 1909 Daniel Burnham Plan for Chicago, because architects are bad at naming things. It was not an interesting name, but it was a very interesting plan because he wanted to turn Chicago into the Paris on the prairie. He wanted art, fountains, monuments, views, a city in a garden. He wanted every citizen within walking distance of a park, which is why there are 614 parks in Chicago today. He created this huge plan for our city because the most important thing to him, Daniel Burnham's most famous saying, was make no little plans, for they have no magic to stir men's blood. And looking around at Chicago today, I don't think he made any little plans. So with those 3 stories, we can see how Chicago took its shape. The fire destroyed, the fair resurrected, and the plan completed. And without those 3 stories, I don't think any of you would even be here today, because you'd just be on some random boat in some tiny little town, listening to me yell about a cow that ruined our city. So we've got a lot of tall buildings ahead of us, some of which are standing out more than others on the skyline. That's the royal family of Chicago, the king, the queen, and the princess. But before we get to that, there's someone hiding at the back of the boat, in plain sight, in the birthday tiara. It's Dolly's birthday today! So, usually people want to sing, I do not sing. So, on the count of 3, we'll just do the royal family. We're going to start with the queen, right ahead of us, the octagonal-shaped building with the round barrels on top. That resembles a queen crown or a queen chess piece. That's 311 South Wacker. She debuted in 1990, and every night since, her crown has lit up the night sky. Unfortunately, also lights it up for birds. They think it's the moon, they crash right into it. So we dim the lights for bird migrations. It works out better that way. The princess is just about to disappear behind this bridge. It's the Art Deco building with the statue on top. It's on your right. That's the Chicago Board of Trade. The statue is Ceres, the Roman goddess of agriculture and grain, and you would recognize it if you saw Batman. That's Wayne Enterprise. In real life, that was the tallest building on our skyline for 35 years, but that doesn't matter, because there's a newer tallest building, the king of Chicago himself, right ahead of you, the Sears Willis Tower. The prime example of black box modernism in our city. He is tall, dark, and handsome, and oh boy is he tall. That was the tallest building in the world from 1974 to 1998. 24 years is a long time to hold that title. How tall is it? Well, up at the top, it is 110 stories, 442 meters, or 1,451 feet. Still the tallest building in Chicago, but it is not the tallest building in the world anymore. That honor currently falls to the Burj Khalifa in Dubai. That That building's a little over half a mile high. For reference, that's 2 Sears towers stacked on top of each other. That is a very tall building. Why else should you care about it? Well, the Burj Khalifa was designed by Adrian Smith. That's the same Chicago architect who designed Trump Tower, which means Chicago is home to the world's tallest architect. Because of the buildings he designs. In real life, he's 5'7". Now, coming up on your right, you probably saw this when we headed down the South Branch before. It's hard to miss. It's the Map Building. This gray piece is a map of the Chicago River. That block in the middle is this building. It's a giant "You Are Here" sign, so I never get lost when I'm right in this spot on the river. But the map is a newer addition. This building added it because they were upset that nobody was talking about them on architecture boat tours. So they spent $800,000 putting themselves on the map by putting the map on themselves. Didn't work though, because I didn't tell you the name of the building. Just kidding, 300 South Wacker. It's just not a cool name for a building. Hi! Lady, do we sell cores? Oh, then don't wave at them. We don't have it. We should. Their building's right there. Why don't you get on that, Dan? You're just hanging out in the back of the boat. Can you call them up? Alright, so the important thing, the elephant in the room that has to be discussed is the Sears or Willis Tower. This is a very contentious debate among Chicagoans because they're a stubborn and nostalgic group of people. So they're still calling it the Sears Tower, the original name for the building. However, in 2009, Willis Insurance began leasing the naming rights. It has been Willis Tower ever since. Personally, I don't care what you call it, but if you want to look local, Sears is the way to go. And if you were wondering, the tallest building in the country is not in Chicago. It is One World Trade Center in New York City. It stands at a very patriotic height of 1,776 feet. However, the roof of the Sears Tower is taller than the roof of One World Trade Center. How can this be? Well, according to the Council of Tall Buildings, which is a real group of people allowed to make real-world decisions, a building is measured from its lowest open-air entryway to the very top of the structure. So buildings like Trump Tower, One World Trade Center, generally newer buildings, they have spires on top, big metal poles. These are aesthetically part of the building, they count towards height. Buildings like the Sears Tower have antennae. Those are mechanical equipment, they do not count towards height. This is disappointing because those antennae are 280 feet tall. How tall is 280 feet? As tall as Gateway Center 1 on your left. Those antennae are the height of a building. That is a lot of height the Sears Tower is missing out on. And finally, my favorite fact about the building, then I'll stop talking about it. The outside of the Sears Tower has been scaled without equipment successfully twice. First time by Dan Goodwin, armed only with suction cups and a Spider-Man suit. He is known lovingly as Spider-Dan. The second time it was climbed by Alain Robert, the French Spider-Man. However, he had no suction cups, no Spider-Man suit, no equipment at all. He climbed the building by wedging his hands around the windows, and he made it all the way to the top in 1 hour and 20 minutes. And what do these two brave men get for this daring accomplishment? Arrested! Do not climb buildings, people. If you were wondering, no, they did not climb back down. They were immediately arrested at the top. People really don't like when you climb their stuff. And speaking of buildings you shouldn't climb, it's all of them. But this is the next one on the tour. On your right, the Civic Opera Building. It's meant to look like a giant throne. And the opera part of the building is in the seat of the throne. A backstage is right against that wall, that's why there's no windows. But the arms in the back of the throne are offices. This was done so the offices could finance the opera, which is a great idea, except this building opened 2 weeks after the stock market crashed in the 1920s. Some very poor timing, it fell into disuse, but things are looking up. It's currently home to the Lyric Opera. And it is an Art Deco building, but they added some extra flourishes like the comedy and tragedy masks just to make it stand out a little bit more. I don't think they really needed to though. This is the only giant chair in the city. Kinda stood out already. And speaking of buildings that wanted to stand out, on your left we have the Boeing building. Don't worry, they built it better than the planes. Just kidding, they didn't build this. This used to be Morton International, that's the salt company. And if you look up at the top, you can see a steel plate with holes cut out of it. That is a bit of postmodernism. Postmodernism is a style all about doing creative, playful, interesting things with the structure. And Morton designed this building, so when you're looking down from above, it looks like a giant salt shaker. Very fun thing for them to do. Now, as we head back towards Wolf Point, I like to talk about some of the pop culture stuff people are usually curious about, and it's Batman. It's always Batman. That's all anybody wants to talk about. So, we've seen some filming locations already, but my favorite one is not along the river. Basically, if you took an Uber 15 minutes north of where we picked you up, where we're going to drop you back off, you would get to the neighborhood Old Town. Old Town has restaurants, bars, comedy clubs. It's where Second City is, if you're interested in seeing a show there. If you are interested in a show in Second City, my recommendations are Wheel of Improv and Clued In. They're great shows. They're not the most expensive shows. And I have a bunch of friends in them, so show up, throw my name around. You're not going to get a discount, but I'm going to look really good. So thank you for doing that. But the restaurant in Old Town is Twin Anchors. Twin Anchors was used in The Dark Knight, the scene where Two-Face is hanging out at the bar. The other cool thing about it, Twin Anchors is said to have the best ribs in Chicago, which is a low bar. Chicago is not known for their ribs, but it's a good restaurant, it's got cool stuff. I recommend checking it out. It was also Frank Sinatra's favorite restaurant in the city, so it's got Batman stuff, Frank Sinatra stuff, something for everybody. And I do believe there is a piece of pop culture that is closer connected to Chicago than Batman or anything really, and it's Ferris Bueller's Day Off. So, if you look to your right, there's the green building with the curve to it. That's the Nuveen building. You would know it better as Ferris Bueller's dad's office. In the movie, the parade's happening, his dad's dancing around. That's this building. So, you mainly saw the inside of it, but they still filmed there, which is pretty cool. You might also remember I mentioned pretty much every building in Wolf Point is less than 10 years old. The Nuveen building is the only exception. It is from 1983, which is still not that old, but considering all these others are about 7 or 8, it makes a bit of a difference. This building was very much ahead of its time, especially considering when it was built, everything else here was parking garages, so definitely has a better view now. There is one building that is less than 7 years old, directly to your left, the tallest, glassiest of the bunch. The Salesforce Tower is less than a year old. That is the newest skyscraper in Chicago. But now as we're leaving Wolf Point for the final time, we can truly appreciate how massive Merchandise Mart is, because that was the largest building in the world at the time of its creation. That is 73 football fields of office space, 7.5 miles of hallways. It takes up 2 whole city blocks, and until 2008, Merchandise Mart had its own zip code. It is no longer the largest building in the world. Nowadays, it's not even in the top 10. The current record holder is the New Century Global Center in China, which is 3.5 times larger than Merchandise Mart. That is a very big building. Now if we look across the river from Merchandise Mart, right up against the wall of the Riverwalk, there's a glass box full of projectors. That is for art on the Mart. And on evenings in the summer, those projectors display an animated art presentation onto the entire side of Merchandise Mart. I think it's cool because the projectors are designed to avoid the windows. They only display around them, so if you're inside while it's going on, you can't tell. Everybody else thinks it's cool because it's free, and there's not that much free stuff around to take it where you can get it. If you are interested in art in the Mart, you are in luck. They started doing that about a week, 2 weeks ago at this point. So if you find yourself along our lovely Riverwalk at 8:30 p.m., you will get a beautiful free art show. And if you miss it tonight, it is literally every night until the end of November, so you got some time. And you should be missing it some nights, because that's when you're going to see Wheel of Improv and Clued In at Second City. It's just a suggestion, you don't have to do it. But if you do go, yell out, Bruce Phillips! Because I know him, and he's not expecting that, so that'll be fun. Now on your left, back to the buildings, we've got this short red brick building with a clock tower. That is the Reed Murdoch building, and it has done a lot in its lifetime. At one point or another, that was regular offices, a grocery warehouse, and even a makeshift morgue. Thanks.
Hello.
So like I was saying, that was a morgue where they have dead people. He was cheering. Cool. Nowadays it's home to Encyclopedia Britannica, so arguably still a morgue. Nobody uses those anymore. But the cool thing about it, you're gonna notice there are 5 bays of windows on the left. The clock tower is the middle, 6 bays of windows on the right. It's asymmetrical. It wasn't always like this. They changed it in 1930. The street we just went under had to be widened, so they chopped off part of the building. As soon as they made the change, they adjusted the facade so it would be almost unnoticeable though. And going from a short building on your left to a short building on your right, because coming up on the other side of the bridge is the very short, very angry looking 55 West Wacker. That is a brutalist style building. Brutalism came about in the 1960s at the height of the Cold War with lots of social unrest. Businesses and the government were nervous and they didn't want to be seen that way. So they designed in the brutalist style, using concrete and raw materials. They wanted to evoke this feeling of an impenetrable fortress right in the center of our city. I just don't think they planned ahead for the future, because this building is now known as Danny DeVito between 2 supermodels, which is not the cool look they were going for. Supermodel right next door is the Leo Burnett building. It's a mystery. It doesn't fit into any style of architecture, so there is not much to say about that one. Everybody smile. There's a picture being taken. Further down on your right, there's a tan building with domes on the edges. That is the Jewelers building. They got that name because it was built to house high-tech offices for jewelers. In fact, it was built with an automobile elevator inside, so you could drive your car into the building and be taken to a higher floor to avoid any potential jewel thieves. I do have to mention, if you think it looks familiar, it's probably because you saw it in Transformers 3. I never used to talk about Transformers on the tour, but the other day someone came on board, I didn't mention it, they got incredibly aggressive. So, for my safety and yours, calm down, Transformers. We're all friends here. That dome up on top, though, used to be home to the Stratosphere Lounge, a high-end restaurant in the roaring 1920s. It was rumored to be a speakeasy run by Al Capone. That is just a rumor. Al Capone was in prison at the time, but still, cool rumor. Spread it. Speaking of Al Capone and some of his favorite things, a little further down on your right, there's that skinny green building with gold foil on top. That's carbide and carbon. It's meant to look like a giant bottle of champagne, because it was built as a protest during Prohibition. Chicago said, if I can't drink alcohol, I'm at least gonna look at it. Although trust me, Chicago is still drinking alcohol. That's why Al Capone was in prison. And taxes. Some other stuff he did. Now once again, we're looking straight ahead at the Wrigley Building, but peeking out from behind it on the right is the Tribune Tower. That is a Gothic Revivalist style building. Gothic Revivalism just means America was borrowing from France. But this building was built because Robert R. McCormick, the publisher of the Chicago Tribune, set up a contest to see who could design the most beautiful office building in the world. This was the winning entry with its grand Gothic features and the flying buttresses, those decorative bridges at the top. Then to prove it was the most beautiful building, they took stones from other beautiful buildings, put them into this one all around the bottom on the outside. If you get the chance, I suggest checking it out. It is pretty cool, but it is very subjective, because they took stones from beautiful buildings, like the Great Wall of China, the Taj Mahal, and Wrigley Field. And I'm not sure those three are equals, but that's for you to decide. Starting to come into view right behind it, you're going to see an Art Deco building with an onion dome on top. That building is the Intercontinental Hotel, and that onion dome is actually a dock for blimps. Unfortunately, no blimp ever landed there, and if you're familiar with the most famous blimp ride in history, I don't think we're ever going to see a blimp land there. Those are not really in style anymore. Didn't exactly blow up the way they thought they would. Thank you. That was a Hindenburg joke. Was it too soon for most of you? And for something a little more recent, on your left, the Apple Store. It's a bit of postmodernism because they designed the roof to look like a giant iPad. More importantly though, right next to it, in between Fidelity Investments and University of Chicago, you will see a canyon of buildings. All the way at the end of that canyon is the John Hancock Tower, the 5th tallest building in Chicago and one of the most iconic. If you want a photo, now will be the time. We only get a brief glimpse from the river, but it will be the black box modernist building with 2 antennae on top right in between these 2 buildings. X's will be crisscrossing on the outside of it. And the Sears Willis Tower from before has the sky deck and the ledge. The John Hancock Tower has the 360 and the tilt if you're interested in doing any of those things. Also, my recommendation is go to the Sears Tower during the day, go to the Hancock Tower at night. Now we're heading back towards the dock, and we still have some stuff to talk about, but before I get into that, one very important announcement: there are no restrooms on our dock. So if you have to use the restroom, it is either now at the back of the boat or walking to Navy Pier. The choice is yours, but when we get back to the dock, the bathrooms will be closed. We gotta get you off the boat so we can get it ready for that next group. So please plan accordingly, either bathroom now or over at Navy Pier. Now, like I said, we have one last building to talk about, but we can't see it yet. So, while we wait, I want to talk about the biggest change to our city, in my opinion. Because we've seen architecture, buildings, roads, bridges. I don't think it's any of that. I believe the biggest change is the river itself. Because if you are unaware, the Chicago River that you are on right now is the only river in the world that humans have forced to go the opposite way. That's because when Chicago first started out, and for far too many years after, this river was used as a sewer system, which is super gross, but it was pretty common at the time. A lot of cities in America did it. You just dumped your sewage in the water, it got whisked away, you didn't have to worry about it. Unfortunately for Chicago, this meant our sewage was going right into Lake Michigan, our source of fresh drinking water. And when your drinking water has sewage in it, people get sick all the time. Chicago was very quickly becoming the cholera capital of the world, and nobody wants to be called that. So, the obvious thing to do was stop using the river as a sewer. Instead of doing that, Chicago called in the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and for 8 years, those engineers dug a canal connecting the Chicago River to the Des Plaines River system, which was at a lower elevation. This way, the power of gravity pulled the water away, reversing the flow of our river. It is a very cool thing to have. It is truly the only river in the world like it, but the reason behind it is not so great. Obviously, still not the cleanest river, but it is doing so much better. Back in the 70s, only about 8 species of fish could live in this water. Now over 70 species live here. So slowly but surely, life is returning to our river. And as you saw on the tour today, architects are helping with that, putting buildings up all along the riverfront, that people live here, they spend their time here, they're drawn in, because when you're looking right at the problem, it becomes a whole lot harder to ignore. View on your left, it's the curvy black box modernist Lake Point Tower. That is a very unusually shaped building. What's even more unusual is where it is located, because that is the only private building on Chicago's public lakefront. It was built over there exploiting a zoning loophole, which was closed very shortly after it was constructed. But Chicago looked out, saw what would happen if we developed our lakefront, and we decided we didn't want to do that. So Chicago's lakefront will forever remain free and clear, so everyone can enjoy it, not just those who can afford to live at the top of the tallest tower. Although speaking of those who can afford to live at the top of the tallest tower, despite the rumors, Oprah never lived there. But the circular part on top used to be a French restaurant called Cité. Oprah frequented it so much, people thought she just lived in the building. And she didn't live there, but other celebrities have, including Chris Farley, Kurt Russell, Goldie Hawn, Tom Cruise, and Halle Berry, among others. My last fun fact about it, Lake Point Tower was featured in the HBO Max series Station 11. This is not important, but it's a show I saw that I liked that didn't get a lot of recognition, so I bring it up. And every once in a while, one person knows what I'm talking about, and they get to feel very special. Now I'm going to stop talking. It's been a lot of me for this whole thing. We're going to head out a little further towards Lake Michigan before we take you back into the dock. As we head back in, I will get back in the mic, do some housekeeping, close it all out for you. But right now, feel free to get up, stretch your legs. Last call for the bathrooms if you need them. Last call for the bar if you'd like to get anything there. Most importantly, the view out here is amazing. Please take some pictures. I'll be walking around, so if you have any questions, just let me know. I will be happy to help.
No apaga la luz. ¿Qué habéis hecho con la calefacción en este pueblo?
Okay, one more number thing. Got a second here. Let's see. You know what you see.
Miss Anne?
Look at that. Oh, is that a video?
Yes, video.
Hi.